Okay, so good evening. So I entitled this C.S. Lewis in the Medieval World, and where I really want to focus on is not so much the medieval world, because that's such a big topic. We will never even come close to getting through it, even if we took every week of the Lent soup suppers, we'd never get through it. So we're going to focus in just a little bit on sort of two aspects and how those flow through C.S. Lewis's writing. So C.S. Lewis was a scholar of medieval literature, so I think if we know the medieval world a little bit better and the literature, we can better understand his writings. He thought the medieval view had great value to us in our day and age, and C.S. Lewis actually lived as a medieval in the modern world. So he's really kind of an interesting guy. And along that line, so in Epic Times, in the end of December, they actually had an article on C.S. Lewis in a World of Bleakness by some guy by the name of Josh Apple. I'm sure nobody's ever heard of him before, but yeah, so there's somebody in the CREC. And coincidentally, I'm actually going to primarily focus on Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe tonight, and there's a little picture of the play of it. So I thought that was convenient timing.
For those who don't, he is the PM of Kuiper Presbyterian.
Yeah, he's now, that's right, he's the PM now, yeah. So the medieval world, as I say, it's far bigger than we're going to look at. So briefly, I want to look at the work that they did to unify everything, and then we'll really look at the cosmology, and that's more what we'll focus on for the rest of the night. So they were unifiers beyond compare. They revered and unified all the writings that came down to them. So that's from the Greco-Roman world, all the early years of the Christian movement before them. And they produced a very coherent worldview that had a lot of meaning and significance. And that's a huge contrast to the world we live in today, which is kind of a meaningless world. There is no meaning to the world. And of course, that all comes from Darwinism. And the unification they achieved is really important to us because it laid the foundation. The world we live in would not exist without the medievals and the unification that they achieved. And then C.S. Lewis was well wrapped up in that world. So as Owen Barfield once said about Lewis, somehow what he thought about everything was secretly present in what he said about anything. And that is a very medieval thought, to take the whole breadth of everything and bring it down to focus in on this one thing. So definitely very, very medieval in that sense. So let's press on here. Cosmology, which is what I want to expand on a little bit. So the medievals still lived in a Ptolemaic world. They did not live in the Copernican world that we live in. So the Earth is the center of everything, and everything expands outward sort of in concentric spheres. So it's like kind of an onion, different rings in that onion as you go outward. Yet for the medievals, the Earth was also at the very bottom of the universe. And so to go up from the Earth beyond Luna was to enter into the musical dance of the heavenly spheres. And that was a really good thing. They thought that was really good. And we sort of see that played out in Ransom's shock during the space flight between Thalcandra and Malacandra. He's shocked that the universe, the space, is full of light and life, not darkness, which is what science fiction and the scientists were all telling us. Well, that's Lewis reflecting back on that medieval view that to go up into the heavens beyond the moon is to go into the heavenly realm. In that Ptolemaic world, each planet has its own unique influence on both the elements in the world that we live in, the people, and the events in the world. There's only 7 planets for them. So they didn't have Uranus because it wasn't discovered till 1781, Neptune 1846, and the protoplanet Pluto was 1930, so well after the medieval world. So those 7 planets are arranged in the following order, which is not quite how we usually think of it. So the first planet out is Luna. Luna is unique of all the planets because it's a boundary between matter and the demonic realm below Luna and the angelic and spiritual realm, which is up beyond Luna. And so that's really kind of a critical thing for us. There's another aspect to Luna that we won't really touch on tonight, but Luna is two-sided. The side that faces us is completely different from the opposite side of Luna. And that plays into his books, but we've only got so much time tonight and too much to talk about. So we'll ignore that. But Luna, the moon, one thing to remember when you see verbiage like sublunary, translunary, under the moon and things like that. To the medievals, that carried more of a spiritual significance than it did a physical description of within the orbit of the moon. And I think even for us today, we should keep that in mind when we read a lot of things, because there's more to that little phrase than just that within or beyond the lunar orbit. So Luna produces silver. In human disposition, produces a wandering disposition. So that would be explorers. And also wandering, as in losing your mind. Hence, where do we get the term lunacy from? It goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And the events, not really clearly articulated. It's more an impact from the people, the explorers, and the people who are kind of lost their mind. Mercury is the next planet out. Mercury produces quicksilver, a.k.a. mercury, old name for it, quicksilver. In a human disposition, it's a mental disposition that's really hard to pin down. Words like studious, philosophical, quick-minded, clerical, profitable, all kind of cover that mercurial influence on us. And same way, the events, it's like every writer has different events assigned to Mercury. So there's kind of no rhyme or reason on that. Next out, we get to Venus. Also, a lot of times, if you're reading in medieval literature, you may see Venus referred to as Fortuna Minor, so lesser good fortune. Venus produces copper in the world. In a human disposition, I'm sure this is going to be shocking, produces beauty and an amorous disposition. Sounds like Venus, right? And produces very fortunate events in the world. Next out, we reach Sol. Sol produces gold. Sol's the sun. And in a human disposition, a very wise and liberal disposition, and produces very fortunate events. Mars, the next one out, minor infortuna, so lesser ill fortune. And I'm sure this is going to be shocking, but Mars produces iron. And in humans, produces a martial disposition and war. So that's maybe not too surprising. That sounds like Mars that we're all used to out of the Greek and Romans. Jupiter is the next planet out, Fortuna Major. Maybe disappointingly, Jupiter produces tin, which we don't really think much of in our day, but to the ancients and to the medievals, tin was a shiny metal that was very highly prized. So it was more important to them than it is to us today. Human disposition, jovial disposition, which is very difficult for us to define in our day and age because we think of jovial as somebody who's laughing and, gay all the time. But jovial really means, think of like a king at rest. He's at peace. He's in glorious pageantry and pomp. There's joyous feasting. All is right with the world and his kingdom. And that's more of what the medievals would mean when they say a jovial mind. And then Jupiter brings prosperity and halcyon days to us. And then lastly, Saturn in Fortuna Major produces lead, produces a melancholy disposition in people, and produces disastrous events. If you ever listen to Holt's The Planets, you can really see that difference in the way he does Jupiter and Saturn. And it really contrasts exactly with what the medievals thought on them. Beyond Saturn, anglicizing the Latin here, we have the stellatum sphere, which is all the fixed stars. Then beyond that, you have the primum mobile, and that's what God would use to set all these spheres spinning with one another. And then beyond that is the Imperium, which is an unseen realm, and it's actually not part of creation because that's where God and the saints reside. So, the medieval realm, why did we go through this? Because if you read C.S. Lewis's writings, the medieval world is just prolific through his writings. We'll give a bunch of examples here, but in the Narnia series alone, it's estimated that there are around 100 references or allusions to historic or medieval writings. So that averages out to 14 per book. So that's a lot of references. So to give you one example of a historic one, the Dufflepuds in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. They are monopods, or also known as sciapods. You go back to the ancient literature, you can find it in Aristophanes, Pliny the Elder, and Apollonius. And in the medieval world, the Burgo de Osma Beatus map from 1086, the Nuremberg Chronicle map of, 1493, Sebastian Munter's Cosmographica of 1544, all have references to these sciapods or monopods. And if you look at Pauline Baines' duffel putt illustration in the books, where he's lying on his back with his foot up above him, and you compare it to the monopod that's in the Burgo de Ozma Beatus map, they are identical. Do you think that's a coincidence, or is C.S. Lewis trying to tell us something there? So he's, again, referring back. So the medieval cosmology, briefly in the Ransom trilogy, I want to take a brief detour through that just to show how he's unified Lewis across his writings. So let's look at Ransom himself. As you go through the books, he becomes increasingly martial. So in the first book, what's Ransom doing? He's running terrified all the time. He's always afraid of everything that he's doing. And at the end of that book, the Oyarsa of Malacandra says, "You are guilty of no evil, Ransom of Falcandra, except a little fearfulness." So he's chastised for that fearfulness. Well, in the second book, what does Ransom do? He fights the unman, first verbally and then physically. And the physical battle, this is interesting, begins after an entire chapter of him wrestling with God about the ludicrousness of fighting the unman. So children, who wrestled with God? Old Testament, all the way back to Genesis. Jacob, exactly. Remember that. Jacob wrestled with God. So then we get to the third book, and in the third book, Ransom is now orchestrating the entire fight against NICE. So he's coordinating all the different people. So in that sense, he has actually now become Mars himself, because he's orchestrating this battle. But C.S. Lewis winds other things in there, because when we see him seated in his room, he's Jupiter, portrayed as Jupiter. So we're seeing him as both Mars and Jupiter in two different roles there in that particular book. That Hideous Strength, another one in there, you can see Mark and Jane Studdock, they transition from being Lunarians at the beginning of the book into being Mars and Venus, respectively, when you get to the end of the book. So they have a horrible marriage. That's the only way to describe it. At the beginning, it's really almost two individuals that happen to be married, and they really have nothing to do with each other. But as you go through the book, Jane, with much foot dragging and don't get taken in, cautions to herself, gradually abandons that modern role that she sees for herself and becomes more Venetian. Then Mark changes from a bootlicking climber whose sole ambition is to be in the inner circle, and he wants to get further and further to the inner circle, and he abandons that and eventually turns against and stands and fights against NICE. And it's one of my favorite scenes in the book is his full awakening to the evil of Nice comes after several pages of wrestling, so there's again Jacob reference, with his reluctance to stamp on a crucifix in the objective room. If I take a step in any direction, he thought, I may step over a precipice. So he eventually refuses, despite the repeated demands by Frost to do so, and says, it's all bloody nonsense, and I'm damned if I do any such thing. So damned both as a figure of speech, and now Mark realizes, literally damned if I go along with this. So he now realizes this is a spiritual battle, and he's now chosen a side. So this is the moment of his conversion in this story and his change. So in the Narnia series, when we get to the Narnia series, each book exhibits the influence of one of these planets. So The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, which is what we'll look at tonight, is jovial. Prince Caspian is martial. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is Solarian. That one's really easy to see. Which way are they heading in the Dawn Treader? Towards the sun, right? And the sun keeps getting bigger, bigger, and bigger, and all of a sudden it gets brighter and brighter, and they can withstand. So that one's really easy to see. The Silver Chair is Lunarian. Again, really easy to see. What's the problem with the prince in that one they're trying to rescue?
He's crazy.
Yeah, he's crazy, right? He's under a spell of the witch, right? Horse and his boys, Mercurian, Magician's Nephew, Venetian, and the last battle is Saturnian, and that one also is really easy to see because everything goes disastrously wrong the whole way through the book. And where does the book ends with the utter annihilation of Narnia until they, go into, the new and bigger and better Narnia at the very close of the book. So each of those goes that way. we're going to look, as I say, just at the Lion and Witch of the Wardrobe this evening. It's jovial atmosphere just because lack of time. So children, I want to ask a question of you before we start that. Who's your favorite character in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe? Lucy, yeah. Peter, yeah. Peter's a real hero, isn't he, in that one? Susan, yeah. Yeah. You know who my favorite is? Mr. Beaver. Practical, down to earth, but yet very wise when you look at his actions through the whole thing. Yes? Mr. Tumnus, yeah. Yeah. He's a neat guy, too. He makes a whole change through the thing, doesn't he? Right? Yeah. Yes. Caspian? Yeah. Okay. So, what we're going to do, we're only going to look at two aspects of the jovial influence. We'll look at kingship, which may be better described in our day as leadership because we don't really quite understand kings in our day and age here in the United States. And we'll also look at joyous feasting. So for kingship, there's multiple contrasts through this book between wrong and right kingship. There's a lot of other contrasts beyond what we'll look at, and those are going to be left as an exercise for the student to ferret out. 1,000-page essay due next week. You know, C.S. Lewis was a university professor, as we would say here, right? So 1,000 pages next week. So the witch and Aslan, the really obvious contrast. So we see the pettiness, the cruelty, and the fear of the witch contrasted with the big-heartedness, the kindness and gentleness, and the bravery of Aslan. So, for example, the witch is willing to sacrifice anything and everybody, including even her dwarf, to meet her own ends and get her own way. But what does Aslan do? He sacrifices himself to redeem Edmund. So complete difference there. So kingship requires sacrificial leadership. Think of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Or he says, I came to serve, not to be served. Or again, my favorite quote out of The Horse and His Boy, one of my favorite quotes of all from the Narnia series. I think I quoted this a couple of weeks ago, but for this is what it means to be a king, to be first in every desperate attack and last in every desperate retreat. And when there's hunger in the land, as must be now and again in bad years, to wear finer clothes and laugh louder over a scantier meal than any man in your land. Sacrificial leadership is really hard, and it's far easier for us to lord it over those that are underneath us than to actually sacrifice ourselves for them. So another contrast is between Edmund and Peter. So Edmund, just like the witch, is willing to sacrifice anything, including his brother and sisters, to get what he wants. So think of him while he's slogging through the snow from the beaver's lodge to the witch's castle. He consoles himself with thinking what he's going to do once he becomes the king, including putting the finishing touches on some schemes for keeping Peter in his place, and thought more and more of how he hated Peter. So just how evil has Edmund become at this point in the story? So children, do you ever treat your brothers or your sisters like Edmund is treating his brothers or sisters? Yeah, I'll admit, when I was younger, I had two younger brothers, and I didn't always treat them nicely. They got picked on a lot by me, so yeah, don't be an Edmund, right? An important lesson for us to learn from this. Edmund didn't do so well in this story till kind of in the middle. But then contrast that with Peter. His first impulse, as soon as they discover that Edmund is missing from the beavers, is to go out and find him. Where did he go? He's gotten lost in the snowstorm that's out there. And even to the point where he wants to fruitlessly storm the witch's castle until Mr. Beaver restrains him. And then later, on meeting Aslan, Peter admits about Edmund betraying them. That was partly my fault, Aslan. I was angry with him, and I think that helped him go wrong. So again, kingly behavior, it takes responsibility both for others and for its mistakes. With Adam's nature, is that hard for us to do? Especially as men, it's really easy for us to own up to our mistakes. And that's something we always have to fight against. And then also Peter fights and kills the wolf captain, Magram, when he's trying to kill the girls. So again, kingly behavior defends the weak against the strong and the wicked. But earlier in the story, Edmund had described, Peter says, oh yeah, we've seen you at school. You like to bully the weaker boys. So he's doing the reverse. So there's that contrast again. So lastly, we get the four Pevensies are installed as kings and queen in Narnia. There's a massive celebration. So Lewis at this point links that authentic kingship with joyous feasting. So think, there was absolutely no feasting while the witch reigned, right? It's always winter, never Christmas. But now it breaks forth because the real kings and queens are coronated. So shifting to joyous feasting, again, I think something difficult to define in our day because our culture defines it as partying, gluttony, drunkenness. Particularly you look on the college campuses, it's just atrocious. They're having horrendous problems. The kids are drinking so much alcohol that they're actually ended up in the hospitals with alcohol poisoning. And you have to consume a lot of alcohol to get to that point, but that's what they're doing. So it's really difficult to describe, and we've lost that sense of joy, mirth, and gratitude for God's bounty, which is why we're joyously celebrating. There's no pageantry or celebration in our day and age when we have a joyous feast. Because our culture hates beauty. Why does our culture hate beauty? Because beauty implies that there's an absolute standard to judge by. Well, if there's an absolute standard to judge by, that means there's a standard giver to judge us. Oh, perish the thought. We don't want God back in this equation. And that's what our culture says. So our culture hates beauty. We have to be really careful about that because we live in this culture. We breathe in this culture. We don't even have to consciously think, and we will absorb what our culture says. So a good example of that I noticed of our culture rubbing off on us, our Christmas Our Christmas charcuterie that we had on Boxing Day was advertised as a formal affair. So it's going to be jackets and tie for the men, dresses for the women. But quite a few people turned up without that attire. So in the CREC, we've done a great job of recovering joyous feasting. We dance, we have a great time, the wine flows, we really enjoy ourselves, but we still have progress to make on pageantry and such. And that's why I really enjoyed Pastor Chase's discussion on why do we have the decorations done like they're done in the church, because that's part of pageantry. Even though in this instance it's barren, because that's reflecting the season we're in. That's part of that. And notice about that culture rubbing off on us. Jacob Russ this weekend in his sermon briefly alluded to that, because in that passage in 1 Peter, what's he talk about? The gluttony, the drunkenness of the parties. Don't be sucked into it. And the amazing thing to me is I prepared this lesson weeks ago. And then I got to see Pastor Chase writing, and I got to hear Jacob Russ saying, oh, I cannot count the number of times that I prepared a lesson and heard a pastor preaching, sometimes literally word for word what I just said, I hear come out of the pastor's mouth. So God moves in our lives sometimes in ways we don't even recognize and see. So just something for us to keep in mind. And I was thinking, every time I read through this and this particular section, I think of the parable of the wedding feast, where one of the men who's pulled in is not in appropriate attire. And what happens to him? Kicked out into the outer darkness where there's gnashing of teeth, right? So also Ecclesiastes 3:4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And when you generalize that principle, there's also a time to dress up and a time not to dress up. Just as it would be inappropriate to wear a tuxedo to one of our summer barbecues, would be inappropriate to wear cutoffs and a ratty tank top to a formal wedding, right? And most of us get that. So just something I think we need to pay attention to, and eventually we will get there, but it's probably going to be it's a generational kind of thing to make some of these changes. So let's look at the lack of good feasting. As I already mentioned, there's that repeated phrase in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, always winter and never Christmas. There's no joy to look forward to, merely the grinding cold of never-ending winter. So children, would you love it if you always had lots of snow on the ground and you got to play in, but Christmas never arrives? No. Isn't that horrifying? I mean, much as I love playing in the snow too, and I'm almost 68, and I love playing in the snow, but I wouldn't like playing in the snow if Christmas was never going to arrive. Yeah, so kind of horrifying. But Lewis is reflecting Advent and Christmas of the medieval world in this phrase and what he's got going on here, because Advent in the medieval world is a time of darkness and want. There are no greenhouses back then. There's no international shipping to get fresh food. So you were living on what you harvested this last summer, and the hog that you butchered in the fall was going to last you all the way through the winter, and that was your supply of food. So they're hunkered down, they're longing and looking for the coming of a Savior. Then, boom, Christmas Day arrives, and now they have 12 days of feasting and celebration. So you ever wondered where that song, 12 Days of Christmas, comes from? All the way back into the medieval world, because that's what they would do. And so the wassail comes out, and they're going from house to house celebrating with one another. For most of us today, if we're honest with ourselves, we're probably close to exhaustion by the time Christmas rolls around, particularly if we have younger children, right? I remember those days. Yeah, I very much remember those days. And we're almost glad it's over. And it's interesting to me, every time I reread The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, I'm always mused, would we be better served if we reverted back to our Christian Advent Christmas tradition as opposed to having adopted kind of our culture's Christmas tradition? It's just something that's always kind of sticks in my mind on that. So let's talk about Turkish Delight. You ever had Turkish Delight? Real Turkish Delight? It's really good, right? Yeah, I remember having a lot of that as a kid, but not a lot at a time. So Edmund finishes an entire box and wanted more. But the queen knew, although Edmund did not, that this was enchanted Turkish Delight, and that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and would, even if they were allowed, going on eating it until they killed themselves. So again, this is another of Lewis's historic references. We should be reminded of the Roman gluttonous feast, where they would feast, and they'd finally get full. So what did? They went out back, vomited, came back in, so they keep feasting. Kind of disgusting, right? But what did Edmund do? Exactly the same kind of thing. And he would have kept eating if he had a chance. Later, when Lucy finds Edmund, he's beginning to feel sick and ill-tempered. Well, small wonder after eating an entire box of Turkish Delight, because it's almost pure sugar. I'd have felt really sick too. Even after one or two pieces, I've had my fill of it. So Edmund's reward, when he tells the queen where his brother and sisters are at, he's promised Turkish Delight, right? What does he get? An iron bowl with some water in it and an iron plate with a hunk of dry bread. The last part of a longer sentence to describe his wonderful, rewarding meal that he gets for doing what the queen wanted him to do. Let's shift to the abundance thereof. The meal at the Beaver's Lodge. Lewis uses a page and a half to describe a simple but abundant and joyous meal of, anybody remember what it was? Trout and boiled potatoes. That was it. A whole meal and a page and a half to describe. And then at the end of it, a gloriously stickly marmalade roll appears out of nowhere. And when they reached the end of the meal, everyone shoved back his or her chair to lean against the wall and gave a long sigh of contentment. So they're content after this simple meal of trout and boiled potatoes, but Edmund's feeling sick after the witch's Turkish Delight. So I think we're kind of being told here there's a right and a wrong way to feast. We can either rejoice over God's bounty, or we can selfishly fulfill our own desires. Then Father Christmas turns up on the scene. We have several pages to describe the gifts to Peter, Susan, Lucy, and the Beavers. And then out of nowhere appears a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. probably doesn't resonate quite as much with us as Americans. We prefer coffee to tea, but I always remember my favorite quote of all time from C.S. Lewis is, "I can never find a book long enough or a cup of tea big enough." So there's a man who's got his priorities right, because I would agree 100%. We actually used to have that stenciled on our wall in our house in Bellevue. So, and the witch in the story, she comes across a group of Narnians joyously feasting and celebrating in the forest on the feast provided to them by Father Christmas. And she subsequently turns them to stone for this gluttony, this waste, this self-indulgence. So here Lewis puts a direct contrast in front of us between the joy of right feasting and the miserly hatred thereof. So something to keep in mind. And then after the children are crowned at Cair-Paravel, there's a great feast in Cair-Paravel, revelry and dancing and gold flashed and wine flowed. That sounds a lot like some of our feasts, maybe not the gold flashing, but everything else we got, right? And remember, Lewis is a polyglot. By the age of about 11, 12 years old, 13, maybe 14, he was already reading in French, Greek, Latin, and German. Any of you know any? Well, I know. Yeah. So Cair-Paravel, what it probably means is lesser court. It's from the Welsh cair for fortress and an old French word paravel for below. So what Lewis is telling us is Cair-Paravel's rule is under the lion, who's is the son of the emperor beyond the sea. Again, that hierarchical view is just intrinsic to the medieval world. And it's something we've kind of abandoned in our day and age, and we're trying to recover. And particularly we see that, this is why I so appreciate some of the work Doug Wilson is doing, trying to recover that hierarchical nature of the family. So again, something we need to work at to recover. So why does all this matter? Who cares? Can't I just read the stories and just enjoy the stories as they are? Absolutely. And matter of fact, we should read them first and foremost just as stories. We need to revel in the beauty of Narnia, the wonder of Narnia, the evil that has to be fought and overcome, the fears we have to overcome. We need to just be able to absorb that and enjoy it. And as we read them as stories, we'll absorb the underlying theme that Lewis has going on in the book. And this goes back to Lewis's idea of a supposal. So, you say, imagine that, and then to understand that, you have to thoroughly immerse yourself in that. And that's how you get into that story, and then you start to find that hiddenness, because, as he used to say, you never come out and tell exactly what the story means, because it's hidden in the entire story. If I want to tell you what the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe means, I will hand you the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because it's the entire story as a whole. And I had that happen to me when I was reading Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. When I got to the end of the book, spoiler alert if you've never read it, but she comes into some money from an uncle who dies, and she ends up marrying a Italian royalty of some kind who's a real piker, because he's only after her because she's got a bunch of money, because he doesn't have any money. And so she marries this guy and then realizes that he doesn't actually love her. And then the guy who really does love her comes along, tries to convince her to go off, and I'm sitting there and says, yes, go off with the... Oh, wait a minute. No, she's already married. So I had literally got so caught up in the story as a whole, and that is actually the lesson that Henry James was trying to teach in that. We need to be careful of who we end up picking to marry, and be wise in how we do that, and seek counsel in how we do that. So that was a real shock to me, that suddenly discovered I'm arguing for something I desperately stand against. No. Yet, as adults, the stories have a lot more to teach us. So you think of Doug Wilson's What I Learned from Narnia, or Joe Rigney's Live Like a Narnian. So children, plug your ears for a minute. Don't listen. Don't listen for a minute. I'm going to talk to your parents. So if we know the medieval background, there's a lot more we can pull out of these stories than just the surface story that's there. And as we do that, we begin to draw connections to universal truths across time that have stood the test of time, that have come down to us, a lot of them even from the Greeks and Romans through the medieval to us. So it is valuable to us. So, okay, now children, you can listen again. So our story is important to us. So the Bible is 70% narrative. You ever wondered, why is the Bible 70% narrative? Wouldn't it be a lot easier if the Bible, we had a book that says, okay, here's how you do a worship service. Here's how you do communion. Here's how you do baptism. Imagine the number of battles and arguments, but we don't have that. God teaches us through narrative because we learn differently from narrative than we do from analytic or didactic type discourse. So ask yourself, which do you enjoy reading more, the book of Genesis or the book of Romans? Which do you remember more, the stories in the book of Genesis or that theological argument of Romans? I bet even Pastor Chase would say probably Genesis. Yeah, right? So all those little vignettes in Genesis, the Garden of Eden, Cain and Abel, the flood, Tower of Babel, I mean, all these vignettes, they each teach us something, but the whole story arc of Genesis also teaches us something. Because where does Genesis start? In a garden. Where do we end in Genesis? In Egypt, not just in Egypt, but where in Egypt? In a prison, right? So Genesis as a whole is teaching us something. How did Jesus teach? Long theological discussions? Stories, parables, including acted out parables. So the water turned to wine is an acted out parable. It's not just something he's saying, but now we're seeing it before our eyes. And every week we come in here for communion and we see that parable, in a sense, played out for us again. So stories are especially, I think, important to our day and age because we've become very, very utilitarian in our day and age. And we have a lot of problems seeing symbolism anymore in our day and age. So that's, again, why I appreciate so much why Chase is talking about why are we doing these changes to the decor, because we don't catch that right off the bat. Medievals would come in and immediately know why this was going on because they lived in a very symbolic world. So we need to watch the literature. So remember Eustace when he first meets the dragon, when the dragon's coming out of the cave, the story goes, Edmund or Lucy or you would recognize it at once. But Eustace had never read any of the right books. He never said the word dragon to himself, nor would it have made things any better if he did. He didn't even know what a dragon was. And what does he become? A dragon. And later in the story, he actually says, I didn't even know what I was, a dragon, until you all told me. Yeah. So reading the wrong kind of books. So what's the value of the medieval model for us today? We know the Ptolemaic physical view of the world universe is wrong. But there's a biblical sense in which the world truly is. Earth truly is the center of creation because God's highest creation, man, is here on earth. Christ died here on earth. So there is a sense in which the earth is the center of the universe. C.S. Lewis points out in his introduction to Athanasius' On the Incarnation, yes, thank you for stealing my thunder chase several weeks ago, reading old books can help us identify errors in our day and age that otherwise we'll be completely blind to because we live in this culture. So it's really easy for us not to see these. So an illustration of this, if you go back and read some of the old Victorian historic novels, they loved historic novels, particularly historic novels set back in the Anglo-Saxon area. So that's why you see all the Victorian names are all Anglo-Saxon names, Alfred and things like this. But when you read those books today, it's hilarious because you see what the Victorians did, and they didn't realize it. They took their Victorian culture and mores and imported them into the Anglo-Saxon world, which completely different than the Victorian world. But they didn't see it. But if you read those books today, it's obvious. Well, at least for someone like me, because I love the Anglo-Saxon period and read a lot, and when I read the Victorians, I just kind of laugh about it. Reading widely the best historical literature, it engenders wisdom because we have to confront the great ideas that have been debated, and come down to us through millennia. And especially, I think, compared to a lot of the entertainment-driven escapism of so many of the modern fiction. Is that necessarily wrong? You know, Di and I, we have a whole collection of the Clive Cussler, Dirk Pitt novels, and I enjoy reading them every once in a while. But I don't only read those. I read other things too. So it's okay to read things like that. You just don't want that to be your sole diet. I remember my daughter, when she was teaching down in Santa Cruz, she had one of her students love that Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and he saw himself as that wimpy kid. And she had to have a long conversation with the parents. You need to have this boy reading some better literature than just books like this, because he was absorbing and becoming those characters in that book. So C.S. Lewis wrote that literature exists to teach us what is useful, to honor what deserves honor, and to appreciate what is delightful. In other words, the true, the good, and the beautiful, which again, you read medieval literature, that's just prolific through there. And it's something in the CREC we're trying to recover. So does that mean we should all go out, buy the Harvard classics or the great books of Western literature? No, I'm not saying that. Though if you do want a good list of books to read, that would be a good list to go to. And if you do want to invest them, I'd recommend, number one, buy them used, not new, because you can get them used. And of them, I'd recommend the Great Books one, because they've got a volume called the Synopticon, which summarizes 102 big ideas, and it cross-references where they are in all the books in the series. So it's really, really a useful series. And I'm surprised every time I think about buy it, and then I look at the list of books and think, well, I've already read almost all of them, and I have a whole bunch of them in my library, so I've never bought them. That every once in a while, I still am tempted. Medievals enjoyed a unified, well-ordered world with a place for everything and everything in its place. And that's completely unlike our age, because we freely hold mutually contradictory ideas simultaneously. So for example, evolution, were you to believe it, says that undirected, blind, random chance is going to produce better things fitted to the environment. Well, contrast that with the modern intellectuals of our day said, well, if we can change you and just set you up just perfectly, you'll be better fitted for the environment. So which is it, random chance or this very careful planning? And we hold both simultaneously in our world. Christendom was in full bloom in the medieval period. It wasn't perfect. There were lots of problems with it, particularly when you look at some of the problems in the Catholic Church. It was really bad, the Roman Catholic Church. But it was the best expression to date that we've seen of Christianity tried to be flown out into every era of their life, every area of their life. So to me, it was one of the high points in Western civilization. And again, as I mentioned earlier, we stand on the shoulders of those medievals, and without them, we would not have the world we live in today. We would live in a completely different world. And we can better understand our world and culture if we understand some of that medieval world, because then we understand some of the underlying foundations of our culture. Because usually those are not seen, or we just take them for granted. Another thing, the medievals, they built on a foundation of Christianity, the Germanic world, and also the Greco-Roman world. So they kind of have this three-legged stool. Well, in our culture, in Western civilization today, what are we trying to do? We're trying to rip Christianity out of this culture. Well, what happens to a three-legged stool if you pull one of the legs off? So guess why the wheels are coming off in our culture? Because we're actually trying to rip out one of the foundations of our culture. That's not going to work well for us. And then lastly, our culture sees value in the present only. So when I was young, the historic time scale was about 50 years. And anything beyond 50 years really doesn't matter anymore. But today, that has shortened down. I'm not even sure last year is even relevant to anymore. You know, that time scale, you know, we live just in this instantaneous moment right now. And you can see that we can rewrite history however we want it. So the 1619 Project is such a great example of that, where even the author admits freely, I'm not a historian and I wasn't writing history. But what is the 1619 Project used for in the public schools? To teach history. Crazy. So it's really crazy. And the medievals, again, saw great value and wisdom in the literature that they inherited. And to them, if it was written, it was true. And so completely different view than we sort of have in our day and age. And we really need that history and inherited wisdom. And I can give you a really simple description of why history is so important to us. What happens to the Bible if history goes away? Poof, it's gone. There is no more Bible because what's most of the Bible made up of? History, right? So yeah, recovering that is really important to us. And you read the Reformers quoted from the church fathers almost as much as they quoted from the Bible. So they understood and knew that history well. So if we want to see reformation and revival in our day, that's one of the things that I think we need to do is recover some of that history. So go forth, live as a medieval Narnian. Questions? I'll open it up for any questions. Yep, I finished about how quickly I thought. Good. So if you want to read and find out a little bit more, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Discarded Image. My copy's old. I've got the Cambridge University one, not the newer Contes one. But he does describe, and he actually goes back and starts with the Greeks and Romans and then carries you through some of the literature and things like that. And it's not the easiest read unless you're familiar with some of this stuff, but it is a really nice book. And then the other sort of companion to that is his Experiment in Criticism. And not necessarily as common, but it's really good because what he does in this, he turns criticism on its head, and his basic thesis here is a good book is read in a certain way. A bad book is read in an entirely different way and can't be read the same way. So it's a really, really fascinating book. If you're interested in some of the other things on C.S. Lewis, how a lot of this medieval world flows through his writing, Jason Baxter has a book called The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. It's one that's on my reading list. I haven't had a chance to get to it yet. Paul Ford has one called A Companion to Narnia. Joe Rigney, as I mentioned already, Live Like a Narnian. That's just a great one because he's using his examples, a lot of his examples in that book is where he's actually counseling college students out of the book of the Narnian books. So yeah, and of course, where's Joe Rigney now? Right? Yeah, I think, was he there when you were there? Or? No. I think he came in after, yeah. Yeah. Michael Ward, actually he has two books. One is Planet Narnia. Planet Narnia, if you want to read it, it's a great book, but I will warn you, it's also a very difficult book unless you understand some of the medieval world, because Planet Narnia is his doctoral thesis turned into a book. And lots of footnotes, and you kind of have to read the footnotes, and then you have to go read the things from the footnotes, come back. But he does have an easier version of that that's a lot more accessible called the Narnia Code, where he's eliminated a lot of that academic ease out of it. And then also just recently, Christiana Hale came out with one, Deeper Heaven, where she takes the same idea that Michael Ward did with Narnia, and she applies it to the Ransom trilogy. And I've got the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But I loved it because I heard it. I listened to an audiobook of it, and I loved it. And I got to get the book. And then last, of course, Douglas Wilson's What I Learned in Narnia. That was probably one of the earliest ones that came out to try to discuss that Narnia. And hey, there's more here than just a children's story.